everyone, and welcome to a short book video. I am a big fan of murder mysteries. Anything starting from the Golden Age and the early part of the 20th century, Agatha Christie, on to the modern authors. I love them all, and I read an awful lot of them. A few years ago, I discovered Japanese murder mysteries, and I love reading them, both for the mystery part, because they're often very good at setting great puzzles, but also, of course, for the immersion in Japanese society and culture, and the whole background is just fascinating. So today I want to tell you about two books which are recent favourites of mine. Amongst all the many books I've read, those two are the ones that stick in my mind and that I personally am happy to recommend. And I will explain why I like them. The first novel is by Keigo Higashino, who is, I believe, quite a big name these days in the genre of detective or murder mystery fiction. This is Newcomer, a story of death in Tokyo. That sounds pretty good to me. As you probably see from the cover, they like sticking little sort of identifying phrases onto books these days, comparing the author with another very well-known and popular author to entice you, obviously, to get the book. I'm not really too fond of that particular marketing practice. In this case, it almost put me off the author because they're comparing him to Stieg Larsson. Now, I'm not a big fan of Stieg Larsson, so that doesn't cut any ice with me. This is not the first book of his I have read, but it is the one I so far like the best. One of the other books of his I have read is the one he's probably best known for. It was apparently an international bestseller, and that is The Devotion of Suspect X. It is an incredible story, and the detail is worked out immaculately, but it just left me feeling a bit cold. I didn't really warm to the characters and their fates that much. It was mainly about the puzzle, really, about the intellectual challenge that the story posed. So I just wanted to show you that I was familiar with his work before I decided to have another go with this novel, Newcomer, and I am so glad I did, because this one to me is really different to the other books of his I've read. I've also read Malice, and that again is incredibly clever and well constructed, but it didn't leave a huge impression on me, and that I'm still thinking about it, no. But this book I will remember for a long time. And the reason is that the people in it come alive. It's also a really, really good mystery. The Guardian says on the back blurb, an intriguing mashup of police procedural and Golden Age puzzle mystery. Yeah, I mean, it's not telling you much, is it? A woman is discovered strangled in the business district of Nihonbashi, Tokyo. Newly transferred police detective Kaga has been assigned to the case. But the more he investigates, the greater number of potential suspects emerge. Kaga must unravel a multitude of secrets, buried somewhere in the dead woman's past and in the last few days of her life is the clue that will lead to the answer. That's a good blurb because it doesn't really give anything away while giving you an impression of the kind of story you're embarking upon. And the Sunday Times calls the book clever and charming. And for once, I completely agree. That's how I would describe it. Now, what is so unusual about this book is the structure. I hadn't come across this before in a murder mystery, and for me it worked really well. There are 9 chapters, and they all give the location of a specific shop in that district. Most of them tend to be smaller shops specialising in some more traditional craft or retail item, like a pastry shop, a clock shop, a rice cracker shop. That's the very first one. And then there's a Japanese restaurant, a cleaning company, and a handicrafts shop. This gives you an idea of the types of places that Detective Keigo goes to investigate. Now, he's not the top honcho. There's a bit of friction there between the Tokyo Metropolitan Police and humble Detective Keigo, who's just a precinct detective. So he's basically sent off to do the legwork, going around interviewing people, trying to see if there's any detail that might help them on with their investigation. He's not supposed to be the one who solves the mystery. Well, guess what? Each chapter is a microcosm of a small social unit, usually a family running the shop, something like that, and you get to know the people. So it's almost like a short story each chapter, but they're all very cleverly linked, of course. And I got such a good insight into what these people's lives are like and what kind of often silly secrets they keep. You know what it's like. This is life, you know. And Detective Keigo is a very, very relatable character. I was just chuckling along, reading about how he approached interviewing people or getting something out of them. He appears to be sort of extremely laid back, certainly for a Japanese police detective. But behind that slightly shambling exterior, there's a very sharp-minded work. So slowly we work our way through layers and layers of detail surrounding the neighbourhood where the murder happened. And how many people, one way or another, had a fleeting connection with the victim or were somehow involved in an activity that gives Keigo another idea of where to look or what to look for. I just looked forward every night to reading another chapter. I love reading my murder mysteries at bedtime, which is really an odd thing to do, I suppose. But I just go to sleep happy, and that's what works best for me. I love my bedtime murder mysteries. So, Newcomer by Keigo Higashino. I warmly recommend it. If you love reading about Japan and life in Japan and enjoy a good murder mystery with it, then I think this really is ideal. So on to my second book, and this, as you can see, is a slim volume, but boy did it have an effect on the Japanese landscape of murder fiction. I think it would be right to call it a classic. So the author is Seishi Yokomizo, and the title is The Honjin Murders. Now this would probably fall into the category of a golden age mystery. It's still within that time frame. Agatha Christie wrote them well beyond the Second World War into the 50s and 60s. And I just want to mention the background because I think it's important for understanding the tone of the story and the style of it. So the story was serialized in a magazine in Japan from April to December 1946. So just after the end of World War II. I imagine he might have started planning the story a bit earlier. Significantly, it won the very first Mystery Writers of Japan Award in 1948. In 2019, it was finally translated into English for the first time by Louise Heal Kawai, and that is indeed the book we have here, the 2019 edition, published by Pushkin Press. The introduction about the author here says that Yokomizo, who lived from 1902 until 1981, was one of Japan's most famous and best-loved mystery writers. He was born in Kobe and spent his childhood reading detective stories before beginning to write stories of his own, the first of which was published in 1921, so he would have been just 19. You can see from this already that he was steeped from an early age in murder mystery stories, and that becomes very, very obvious in the Honjin Murders. He went on to become an extremely prolific and popular author, best known for his Kosuke Kindaichi series, which ran to 77 books. And that is the detective Kindaichi who's being introduced here in the Honjin Murders, and regarded as one of Japan's great mystery novels. And I would say it's not just one of Japan's great mystery novels, but one of the great mystery novels, full stop. I had read 2 other books by Yokomizo before reading this one. One of them is The Inogami Curse and the other Death on Gokumon Island, and I like them both, but this one, to my mind, just stands above all the others. It's only 180 pages, the story itself, and every sentence, every paragraph matters. There is not a word wasted. And that's something that appeals to me as a great short story fan. It has that compactness, that concentration that I love in good writing. Now, I have to mention that there are also just a few aspects to the storytelling which for a modern reader might be slightly off-putting. For example, the detective Kindaichi himself, he's sort of stereotyped a little bit. He's an amateur detective, and he's always described as scruffy. He wears quite sort of traditional old type of clothes, even for that time, the 1940s. And he's got a thatch of unruly hair, which when he gets excited about something, and he only really gets excited about murders, he starts scratching furiously, and that happens an awful lot. So every time he's got an idea or he's found a clue, he starts scratching that hair, and it has to be mentioned every time. If you can overlook that, and maybe 1 or 2 other little bits, I think you will find this is a real gem, especially for those of us who are, as readers, steeped in murder mysteries, both classic and modern. The love of the classic murder mystery is so obvious in this book. It's almost like a textbook for this genre, and in particular for the special murder mystery called the Locked Room Mystery. Locked room mysteries are incredibly popular in detective fiction, and I always think that to any author, it's the sort of ultimate challenge to make it not just a technical puzzle, but an interesting story. And I think it's very obvious that Yokomizo set himself such a task. He virtually says so. The other aspect I find really intriguing about this book is the point of view it is told from. We start out with the author of this story talking in the first person, describing how he ended up in the village where the murder was committed and how he became involved. The very first sentence is, "Before recording the strange history that follows, I felt I ought to take a look at the house where such a gruesome murder was committed. I was evacuated to this rural farming village in Okayama Prefecture in May of last year at the height of the bombing raids. And since that day, everyone I've met has talked to me at least once of what some call the Koto murder case and others the Honjin murder case at the home of the Ichiyanagi family." And now it gets really interesting and also quite funny. Generally, as soon as people hear that I'm a writer of detective stories, they feel compelled to tell me of any murder case with which they have the slightest personal connection. I suppose rumours of my profession had reached the ears of the villagers, so every single one managed to bring up the topic of the Honjin murder case at some point. For the people of this village, there could hardly be a more memorable case, and yet most of them were not aware of the full horror of this crime. I haven't even finished the first page yet, and when I read it the first time, that book had me in its grip, in a vice-like grip. Usually, when people tell me these kinds of tales, they never turn out to be as interesting to me as they are to the teller, much less potential material for a book. But this case was different. From the moment I heard the first whispers about the case, I was fascinated. And so was I by that stage. He's throwing some pretty funny shade at the profession of the murder mystery writer, while sort of acting as the maître d'œuvre for the whole scenario. Throughout the story, we change point of view and we are privy to several people's observations. So page 2 is now all about the locked room mystery. The genre in detective fiction, that is. Yokomizo blithely and confidently assumes that we as readers are somewhat familiar with the locked room mystery and that we are, like him, insatiably interested in this. The locked room murder mystery, a genre that any self-respecting detective novelist will attempt at some point in his or her career. The murder takes place in a room with no apparent way for the killer to enter or exit. Constructing a solution is an appealing challenge to the author. As a writer of detective novels myself, I intended one day to try my hand at one of these, and now I've been unexpectedly blessed. One has fallen right into my lap. I know it's shocking, but I feel I owe a debt of gratitude to the killer for devising such a fiendish method to stab this man or woman. He had me chuckling and wound around his little finger by now, did Seishi Yokomizo. He then goes on to describe how he, the author, racked his brain trying to think of similar cases among all the novels he'd read, and obviously he'd read a lot. The first that came to mind was, of course, the great classic of the locked room mystery, The Mystery of the Yellow Room, by Gaston Leroux, which was written in the early years of the 20th century. And then he quotes various authors, both British and American. Finally, Dixon Carr's The Plague Court Murders, another famous one. And then he goes on to describe the similarities between this particular case and the original, The Mystery of the Yellow Room, which means we're getting into the detail of the story itself. And obviously I'm not going to tell you how the story goes. So while this book is a traditional murder mystery and what's more, a locked room mystery, it is at the same time, because it's told by a detective novelist, a kind of reflection and investigation of the genre itself. When I finished the story, the first thing I did was go back to the beginning and read the opening chapter again, straight away. I was blown away, because everything that's revealed throughout the story, and in particular about the motive, because he doesn't neglect that, he goes deeply into the psychology of what people do and why they do it. Hidden away in what reads so charmingly in the first chapter are little details which give a very clear marker, a clue, as to what this whole murder case is really about, the essence of it. But you don't notice it when you read that first chapter, because how could you? It's just a part of the story. It is done so intelligently and yet so naturally that I have to say that's true mastery of this particular genre of mystery story. Just talking about it now, I'm still just amazed. Yokomizo is quite fond of addressing the reader sometimes directly, as was very common in novels of an earlier age. But I always felt like he was teasing the reader just a little bit, saying, "Are you paying attention? You got this, didn't you?" Chapter 10 is actually entitled A Conversation About Detective Novels. After the murder case was solved, Kosuke Kindaichi would often talk about this moment. To tell the truth, at first I didn't have much interest in this case. So the amateur detective Kindaichi goes on to describe what was the moment that got him really, really intrigued and wanting to solve this. And it was the idea that this was very much a deliberate, locked room murder. Challenge accepted. If it was brains and logic and wit that were required, I was ready to do battle. The inspector in charge of the case at the time, however, found his excitement childish. So I just wanted to demonstrate that this is as much about the stories we grew up with as he did as a child with murder mystery novels. These stories have an incredible effect on shaping our minds and how we see the world. You could say it's probably one of the most artificial structures you can think of that a human would devise, and that is a locked room murder mystery. To make that believable in ordinary human everyday terms is quite a feat. It is only in chapter 8 that Kindaichi, the amateur detective, actually appears on the scene of the crime. And here's a bit of a description of him, which I will just give you for flavour. So it was the day after the discovery of the murder that a young man alighted at the railway station and came sauntering down the road towards the town. He was around 25 or 6, of medium build, on the pale side, and he would have been completely unremarkable if it weren't for his unusual choice of clothes. He wore a matching set of short haori jacket and kimono in a kind of splash pattern dye, with the traditional hakama skirt of narrow stripes over it. However, the haori and kimono were full of wrinkles, and the hakama conversely had lost any trace of its crisp pleats. His wooden geta clogs were worn down, his hat had lost its shape, In short, for a young man in the prime of life, he seemed shockingly indifferent to his appearance. Scruffy. His haori was bulging at the chest. It appeared to be stuffed full of journals or notebooks. In those days, Tokyo was full of characters like this one. You'd find them hanging around the boarding houses in the university area, or in the writer's room, in theatres, in the seedy part of town. This was the man that Ginzo Kubo had summoned by telegram, Kosuke Kindaichi. In the collective memory of the villagers, even those most closely involved in the case, this young man is still something of an enigma. How could that scruffy-looking youth manage to do what a police inspector couldn't? I suppose they make them different up in Tokyo. Anyway, that was the gossip at the time. This is how I first heard that the young man had played such an important role in the solving of the Honjin murder case. And here we have the author himself speaking again. Since then, I have pieced together all the different accounts and have begun to believe that the youth, with his apparently relaxed, easy-going demeanour, had something of the Anthony Gillingham about him. Please, ladies and gentlemen, don't be confused by my sudden throwing out of a foreign-sounding name. This is the lead character in the detective novel The Red House Mystery by my favourite British author, A. Milne, better known for Winnie the Pooh, of course. Anthony Gillingham was also an amateur detective. So here we see again how detective stories are all the time woven into this story that's being constructed by the novelist about this murder case. He just cannot help himself. He sees everything in terms of detective novels. So this is a way of telling a story that's quite old-fashioned in many ways, and it may not appeal to everyone. In fact, I would say it's probably more of a minority taste. I thought it was terrific. I happily overlooked the few slightly incongruous or annoying features like the constant hair scratching. Everything else is just so well told. I had the sense the whole time that I was in the hands of a master storyteller, and that's what I look for in a book, whether any other kind of novel or a murder mystery. So this is the Honjin Murders, a very classic Japanese story infused with the knowledge and appreciation of Western mystery fiction. So I hope you enjoyed me talking about these two favourite books of mine. Maybe you might even try one of them. Let me know. As always, thank you very much for your time. I wish you a very happy time over Christmas and the holiday season, wherever you may be. I have a lot of books to read and many games to play over what is our summer holiday here. I will see you again later in January and hope you have a very good start to the new year. Please keep well. I'm Food for Dogs. Bye-bye.